John chapter 10, and we looked at the story of the illustration of the Good Shepherd. Just a little bit in the way of review. We talked about the responsibilities of shepherds. We talked about how um, they are not the most gifted animals that God created. In fact, Clara told me a funny story about her husband hauling a big truckload full of sheep. And the brakes got hot on the truck and caught the tires on fire. He got off the road, jumped out, jumped in the truck to throw those sheep off to try to save them. And once they hit the ground, they just got back up and jumped back in the truck. Not the brightest creatures God has created. That's right, that's right. But that was a great story. Couldn't have illustrated it any better. Um, we even talked about many times that shepherds have to go in and actually drive the sheep out of the pen so they'll go get water. That's how sometimes stubborn they can be. We also looked at that word shepherd is not always looked upon in a positive way. In some cultures, shepherds were notorious, irresponsible, farmhands, if you were, lazy drunks even. And so we need to keep in mind that term shepherd can be noble or it can be shameful. Now, we talked about how we started chapter 10 with a double affirmation, where in some of your translations it will say truly, truly. In the New King James Version it says most assuredly. And what that means is Jesus never used a double affirmation to begin a new story or a new discourse, if you will. But it was always a follow-on what had been previously said, and to indicate that this next statement that he was going to make is very important. You need to listen. And what he was talking about is the healing of the blind man and what the Pharisees said about it in the last 5 or 6 verses of chapter 9. Now, we also talked about, in the way of a review, that the first 5 verses of chapter 10, a lot of people do refer to it as the parable of the Good Shepherd. But in reality, it's not really a parable. As Jesus used in the other 46 ones that he gave, it's technically what they call an allegory. A parable, just as we talked about, is an extended simile, usually using a term of comparison such as like or as. And we went to a couple examples of the mustard seed and the 2 builders and saw that. A parable usually teaches only one truth, whereas an allegory can teach several. To appreciate Christ's illustration, who would have been his audience, I asked, and the answer was it would have been the same people that were in the chapter 9. Would have been the Pharisees, the blind man probably himself, his own disciples would have been there and would have heard all that. We talked about what a sheepfold was. A sheepfold is basically a pen, doesn't have any roof on it or anything like that, made of loose stones or sometimes thorn bushes to keep the animals inside there protected at night. And there was a doorkeeper, and the doorkeeper would make sure that no harm came to the animal as best as he could. He often would even lay down in front of the entrance and be the gate himself in situations like that. And it talked about that the true shepherd, the shepherd that the sheep knew, when they heard his voice, they would obviously follow him. Shepherds led; they didn't drive their animals back then, and that's a little different than what we have in Western culture now. But back then, they were out in front. We talked about just as a basic trait of leadership that you can't lead from the rear. You have to be out in front. And we talked about that. Any questions so far on the review? Just going over things kind of quickly, I know. Okay, and then we talked about in verse 6, it says Jesus used this illustration, and that's the term In some translations, it will say figure of speech. Um, and he goes in verses 7 through 9, where he says, again, most surely I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. And all who ever come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. He says it again. For anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. We talked about there's only one door that you can go through to get to heaven, to God. Okay. Any thoughts or comments before we move on back to verse 11? All right. Let me get myself. We went over in fact, we went over all the rest of 11 through 21 fairly quickly on Sunday, but I wanted to go over it a little bit more in depth. Notice in verse 11, Jesus returns to the theme of the Good Shepherd. He said, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd gives his life for the sheep. One thing Jesus was not just a good shepherd, he was the capital G, capital S shepherd. Okay? In the Greek text, that word good translates, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but kalos, K-A-L-O-S, and describes something that is right, proper, better, honorable, honest, beautiful, and precious. And that certainly would fit the description of Jesus here. We see here that kalos relates to the readiness in which the shepherd willingly lays down his life for the sheep. Think about this for a minute. What is this, verse 11? What is this if it's not a prophecy of the cross? Read it again. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. That's what it is. It goes far past just being a metaphor. Far past that. For while it is and was true that shepherds were known to lose their lives in defense of the sheep, okay, there is no record of any having consented to do so voluntarily. Think about that for a minute. Jesus, we know, willingly gave himself up to die for men. Now, he is contrasted here against the worthless shepherd who leaves the flock in verse 12 and 13, actually. Let's read that together. But he who is a hireling and not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. Jesus was simply saying here, he who is the hired man sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. Now, who does the wolf represent? Satan could be. Sin. Well, let's turn over to Matthew 7:15 real quick. There you go. I heard it in the back. Yeah. In Matthew 7, verse 15, it says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. Yeah. False teachers, false prophets, are driven by Satan and evil and things of that nature. And their modus operandi, if you will, the way they operated is they always scattered the flock. That was what they did. When you separate animals, they become more defenseless, if you will, because there's strength in numbers. Now, unlike the thief and the robber, a hired hand was not evil. We talked about thieves and robbers. Thieves do what they do secretly sometimes, under the cover of darkness a lot of times. Robbers just outright use force. robbed at gunpoint. It was the example I remember giving. The hired hand is just that, though. He's one hired for wages to perform a certain task, and that task was to take care of the sheep. Now, what is or what was his primary concern? When you think about it, really, deep down, money. Yeah, the wages. Wages rather than the sheep. He was different from a shepherd who was the owner of the sheep, okay, and who actually cared for them and sought their welfare. So that's important. When there was no danger to the flock, the hired hand would perform his task well, did a good job. But when danger was impending, he was more concerned about his own safety than that of the sheep. Yes, that's right. That is absolutely true. Yeah. The hired hand does not have that vested, I'm going to put love, for the flock. Any other thoughts or comments? Those are good. Yes, Mark. Yeah, that happens so many times. That yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, for sure. Um, Question: who does the hired hand represent? Thoughts? Could be. Could be. Yeah. Here. what I found here was scholars are not in agreement with this, but many believe it to be a reference to the religious authorities slash leaders, like those who cast out the blind man in hopes of advancing their own agenda. What were we talking about? People sneak in here and start, making friends, and it just they have their own agenda. Yeah. So that's what I gathered the hired hand sort of represents. Any more? Yes, Wayne. Yeah, gets his wages. That's right. Yeah, and we talked about this on Sunday that some of these sheep stay with the shepherd for years and years and years, especially the ewes because they're making more sheep, you know, and so that's important. Yeah, exactly, exactly, and that's why the shepherd, the true shepherd, will go out and find that one lost sheep. Return. Yeah, all good points. Yes. Right. Right. Yeah. And we're told in the Bible how a worker ought to work for his boss. You know, that's right. That's right. Um, Look at verse 14, if you would. Again, he repeats himself in verse 11. Verse 14 says, I am the good shepherd. Go back to 11. I am the good shepherd. This verse should be read in close connection with the next one, okay? Because the union between the Father and Christ is like that between the Lord and his church. 14. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own. By my own. Now, although his own do not know the Lord with the same completeness of knowledge that he has of them, okay, obviously, nevertheless, they know of him, and they know a little bit about him. His mind is in them, okay? His name is upon them. His joy sustains them, his love forgives them, and his spirit guides them. Questions? Comments? That's right. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Yeah, it's very true. Good point. Other comments? Okay. Notice in verse 15. No, I'm sorry, I already said that. No, yeah. Notice in verse 15. The full nature of this knowledge which the first person of the Trinity has of the second, and the second of the first, hope that's not confusing, is something far beyond man's finite understanding. We don't understand fully that Trinity relationship. Uh, in short, it's a deep mystery, if you will. It's a knowledge so high and so deep, so intimate that no words can fully explain it while we're down here. I think we all agree with that. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at verse 16. Verse 16 says, Another sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. We talked about this a little bit on Sunday. It would seem that, who would that be? The Gentiles. Yeah. In chapter 9, it's saying that the fold included some from inside Judaism, such as the man born blind. Here in verse 16, the flock included those from outside Judaism, in other words, the Gentiles. And it's important to remember that after the establishment of the church, all people, whether Jew or Gentile, could become members of that one flock with Jesus as the shepherd. This is the one body that Paul spoke about in Ephesians 3 and 6. Yeah. Yeah, it says, I'm going to read verse 5 also, which in other ages was not made known to the sons of men as it has been revealed by the Spirit to his holy apostles and prophets, that the Gentiles should be fellow heirs of the same body and partakers of his promise in Christ through the gospel. Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting in Burton Kaufman's commentary, as well as some others. uh, it says that the King James version, the old King James version, according to Burton Kaufman, is incorrect in the rendering of this. They call it one fold. Okay, Jesus here changed the from the word fold to that of flock, and because due to the metaphor, it might otherwise have appeared that the Gentiles were to be called into the institution of, if you will, of the Jews. Does that make sense? Everybody's just kind of staring at me. I think it does. Okay. Jesus here changed from the word fold, which he had used earlier, to that of flock because, due to the metaphor, it might otherwise have appeared that the Gentiles were to be called into the institution of the Jews. What's happening here, there was to be a new institution, God's one flock. Maybe that helps clears it up a little bit. Any thoughts on that before we move on? We see in verse 17, as Jesus is drawing this discussion to a close, says, "Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it again." Please note that the death of the shepherd has already been announced back in verses 11 and 15. We talked about that. The good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. I lay down my life in verse 15. This same announcement was made in verse 17 without one word. One word's missing. Can you see what that word is? Shepherd is not there. It is without the shepherd imagery. Okay? And so my question is what point is Jesus trying to make here? Good shepherd gives his life for the sheep, 15 or 11. 15, as the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. Then in 17, therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, sheep's gone, that I may take it again. I think the point that Jesus is making here is that he here has expressed his absolute freedom and authority both to die and to rise from the dead. I think that's the point he's trying to make here. There are three differences between Jesus laying down his life for the sheep and that of a shepherd doing so in the metaphor. These are, number one, Jesus' death is altogether voluntary. Okay? But not like the shepherd involuntary death while, let's say, for example, fighting against a robber. Okay? The shepherd might indeed die, but certainly not willingly. Okay? Number two, Christ's death actually saves the sheep eternally, whereas the death of a shepherd would only hasten the death and destruction of the sheep. Because now he's gone, there's nobody to take care of them. They are truly on their own. And then the last one, 3, Christ will lay down his life, but with a purpose of taking it up again, something no earthly shepherd can do. No earthly shepherd can do. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Wayne? Yes. Right. Gentiles. That's a much better way to put it. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, much easier. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, let's look at verse 18. It says, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father." Jesus is saying what here? That's right. All that Christ did on this earth was done in complete harmony and obedience to the will of God. It was. This verse amounts to a, if you will, a shout into the very face of his enemies that they could not kill Jesus until he was ready to die. I mean, we have evidence of that over in verse 31 of chapter 10. Then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. It was true that they tried to, but they did not succeed, obviously. Again, notice the Jews' reaction in verse 19 through 21 when all this. "Therefore there was a division again among the Jews because of these sayings. And many of them said, 'He has a demon and is mad,' or insane, maybe your translation says. 'Why do you listen to him?' And then others said, 'These are not the words of one who has a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?'" Think about just common sense for a minute. I mean, how could you, call somebody mad or insane or a demon when they perform a miracle like they did to a person who has been blind since birth? Pharisees went and asked the blind man's parents, "Has he been blind since?" "Yes." But yet they did not believe him. Again, we find that Jesus' wonderful words brought about a division among the people. Look about what they say about him. Again, he is a demon. He is mad. He's insane. But in verse 21, others stood up for him. Others stood up for him. Jesus confronted people in such a way that a decision had to be made concerning him. Okay? So it was that way back then, and so it is today. You have to make a decision. You cannot sit on the fence. Question? Comment? Oh, yeah. Amen. There you go. Yeah. No one can remain neutral when it comes to Jesus. You can't do it. It demands a decision be made either for him or against him. And I want to close with just a little bit more about this voluntarily laying down his life. I'm going to read a lot of this because it came out of one of the additional reading materials. It says, "Jesus, often called Son of David in the Gospels, was and is the Good Shepherd," capital G, capital S. "He was so committed to the care and welfare of sheep entrusted into his care, which is you and me, that he laid down his life for us as David did for his flocks. Speaking as the Good Shepherd, Jesus made it clear," and this really drives home the point for me, "he would go to the cross on his own initiative." Okay? Own initiative. Judas, the chief priest, Pilate, and the crowds would all have a part in Jesus' crucifixion, but they did not realize that such an atrocity could happen only because Jesus was willingly going to lay down his life for his sheep. Again, the Good Shepherd. We know later in the Gospels of John, two statements remind us of what Jesus said in his Good Shepherd Discourse. It says, during Jesus' trial, remember, the Roman governor Pilate asked Jesus a question. When he refused to answer Pilate said, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and I have the authority to crucify you?" In chapter 19:11. And although no one understood at the time, Pilate could never have crucified Jesus if Jesus had not allowed himself to be crucified. That's So many people don't get that. The crucifixion was actually the loving sacrifice of the Good Shepherd. At the end, when Jesus was hanging on the cross, we remember this from our readings, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. No one murdered him. No one tricked him. No one trapped him on the cross. He gave up his spirit himself. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Jesus knew exactly why he was on earth. Knew exactly. And that relationship between him and the Father is such a close, intimate relation. You know, we talk about the Trinity again. Don't fully understand it, but pretty amazing. Oh yeah, even all authority given to him. That's right. You're gone. He has no idea. He thinks he's in charge. Yeah, we've all been there. Yeah, I know what you mean. Been there, done that. Won the T-shirt. Okay. Any? Yes. Wait. You know, you know, yeah. I probably so. You know. Yeah. I know that Judas hurled himself out there. So. Oh yeah. Especially when all the things happened when he died. The signs. If there's no other questions, if you want to break out your questions, if you have them, I'll go over them real quick, and I think our timing is going to be about perfect. Um, I'm using the individual study guide because it has more questions. I think the other one had some of the questions, but John 10, 1 through 5 is generally referred to as what parable? Parable of the Good Shepherd is what we sometimes call it. And what is the meaning of the word parable? Remember, it's an extended simile, if you will, using things such as terms of comparison like or as. Um, Parable usually only teaches one truth. What does that Greek word paramia mean? And I talked about it early on briefly. It's beside the way. Beside the way. Did sheep know the sound of their shepherd's voice? Yes. Um, what did Jesus mean when he said, "I am the door"? He's only one door. To be saved, people must enter through that door. Number 7. Oh, I skipped number 3. I'm sorry. What is an allegory? Jesus was simply saying, I'm sorry, allegory is an extended metaphor. It's a comparison which uses no term of comparison, if you will, teaches several truths. Number 7, what is the meaning of the reference going in and out? And I think we talked about that in length. That didn't mean you can go in and out of sin and do all that kind of stuff. But what it means is Jesus was simply saying that in him, the good shepherd, the sheep would have perfect security and freedom from harm and danger. At night, he herd them, lead them into the sheepfold to be kept safe at night. At, during the day, the true shepherd would come and get them, take them out to the fields to feed and all that. They had perfect freedom and free from any harm or danger. Uh, Question number 8, according to John 10:10, what is one of the greatest statements about why Jesus came into the world? An abundant life, that they may have life more abundantly. Think about that for a minute. That's sometimes beyond comprehension. Other sheep is reference to whom? We talked about the Gentiles. Number 10, contrast the sacrificial nature of Jesus with the self-serving religious leaders. The Pharisees really didn't care about the sheep, did they? Yeah. They were in it for themselves. And that's the key point, I think. They didn't really care about what happened to them, whereas Jesus obviously does. Okay. Time, I quit right there. Yeah. Yeah. I see that where it could most definitely be that. I'll have to, it makes sense to me that you said it. I don't remember. Oh, yeah. Put to death, supposedly. Right, right, right. I do like that explanation. I most definitely agree with you. I don't remember reading anything about that in any of the extra handouts, but I think you're right. I really do. Anything else? Thank you very, very much.